Chapter 97, The Heavenly Prison Bullies Weak Girls. Because the supervisory yuan is directly under the command of His Majesty the Emperor, so now the heavenly jail of the Kingdom of Qing is not in the Ministry of Justice, nor in the Delisi, but is located here, guarding a number of serious criminals, with extraordinarily strict security. The location of the heavenly jail is not far from the supervisory yuan. Just turn a corner and you will arrive. Once something happens, you can immediately support. Wang Qinian now, at least on the surface, is no longer a part of the supervisory yuan, but by virtue of Fan Xian hand the waist plate, the two easily gained the trust of the guards, into the heavenly prison. The two iron doors of the heavenly jail opened silently, and there was none of the eerie sound of grinding iron that Fan Xian had imagined. The guard in charge of the guards carefully checked their waist tags and respectfully invited the two of you to enter, then closed the iron doors from the outside. Inside the iron door is a long downward tunnel. Dim oil lamps are lit on both sides. The stone steps are slightly slippery, but there is no moss. It seems that the weekdays are very carefully taken care of. Walking down, every distance will be able to see a guard. These guards look inconspicuous, but Fan Xian carefully measured, found that they are actually more than the fourth grade of the role. I don't know how long I walked. The air became a bit muddy, and the muddy light around them blended together, making one's senses become a bit sluggish, as if this place had already left the fresh earthly world, and had already reached the yellow springs of the evil land. Please show the two adults the relevant documents or the inner palace oracle. A cell head with somewhat cloudy eyes glanced at Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian was very respectful to this cell head and handed Fan Xian's belt tag over. The cell head looked very old. The wrinkles on both sides of his cheeks had been squeezed into a dry soil ridge after being washed by fine water. He received the waist plate and then looked at Wang Qinian with a somewhat strange look. Little Wang, promoted? Wang Qinian respectfully sidestepped, making way for Fan Xian, who was fully caged in gray and black robes behind him, and introduced himself. Today, I accompanied this lord to come and try the case. Realizing that he couldn't see the other party's face, but knowing the weight of this belt tag in his hand, the cell head nodded and took out the key from the table, unlocked the door beside him, and with a wave of his hand invited the two to enter. Fan Xian frowned, thinking to himself, could it be that he would have to ask Sariri through the fence later? He was unwilling to expose his voice in front of too many people, so he turned around and gave a wink to Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian smiled and shook his head. Watching the iron door close behind him, Fan Xian asked with some curiosity, "Why are you afraid of him?" Wang Qinian said with a sad face, "He is the former organizer of the 7th Division, who spent his entire life in prison, and when he reached his years of release, he actually preferred to come back and continue to be a jailer, saying that he likes the smell of blood here. Do you think I can't be afraid of such a person?" Fan Xian winced, thinking to himself that there really was a nest of perverts in this inspectorate, and back then, when his mother paid to get such a monster organization out, he really didn't know what she was thinking. According to what they had asked earlier, the two of them conveniently found the cell where Si Lili was being held. Looking at the charming-looking woman inside the bars, Fan Xian frowned. A weak woman, locked up in such a horrible place, but the sitting posture and demeanor remained calm and composed. It seems that the other party must have been a trained character in Beiki. But then he thought, it seems that Si Lili is not really a powerful person, otherwise he would not have fled from the capital, but would have thrown himself into the net, climbed a few big names, and made the dynasty of Qing dynasty uneasy day by day. Fan Xian did not know that his inference was extremely consistent with the official who escorted Si Lili back to the capital. He removed the gray robe covering his head, looked at Si Lili, and said gently, "Miss Lili." Si Lili has long known that there is someone outside the pen, just arrived in Kyoto today. There is someone to open the trial. It looks like they are still extremely important to themselves, so deliberately put on a look of calmness and self-containment, but didn't expect that it would be Duke Fan. Fan Gongzi? Si Lili was incomparably surprised, but forced herself to hold back her calling voice. "Miss C, once we parted at the Drunken Immortal residence, it's been more than a month, and I really didn't expect to see each other again, but under such an occasion." When he thought of sleeping together in the same bed, his fingers were full of fragrance, his mouth and tongue were intertwined. How had he ever thought that this woman was actually a secret agent of Northern Qi? Seelili didn't know what to think of, said with a gloomy face, I never thought that Mr. Fan would be so deeply hidden. Fan Xian sighed quietly, thin jade xiao xiao yi shui too, the wind is suitable for clear night and the dew is suitable for autumn. The immortal steeds are even taught to stand next to each other, and they are all the first class on earth. I thought that even if you and I were just people who happened to be traveling together on a journey against the odds, it would still be considered a great destiny. I really don't understand why the girl is willing to do this to me. This poem was written by Qian Weiyan in his previous life, and it was about being noble and unassuming. Fan Xian thought that since Seelili was famous in Beijing, known as a talented woman, and always survived in the eyes of the people, she should be a bit noble in her bones. He deliberately sighed at this time, intending to weaken the female scout's mind. Unexpectedly, Seelili slowly lowered her head, seemingly untouched. Fan Xian sighed again, Emily is a thief. Seelili smiled sweetly, really a good person like Orchid, Gongzi can enter this prison to see me. I think the identity is not simple, we each serve for the Lord, why talk too much? Fan Xian extinction poetry sigh with the end, the result of no use. He smiled bitterly thinking that not every woman is easy to revel in this kind of scene. He is too ridiculous, slightly stabilized his mind. His hand has more than a small pot of medicine bottle. He threw the vial in and said coldly, this is poison, someone will always come to force a confession. If you don't want to suffer a living sin, swallow it yourself. The small vial rolled twice on the hay, and stopped at Seelili's side. Seelili picked up this small porcelain vial, and clutched it tightly. She had never thought that the gentle and amiable Mr. Fan, who had been gentle and amiable earlier, had turned into a devil who tempted her to die in the twinkling of an eye. If she was willing to die, she would not have fled Kyoto in the first place. Fan Xian realized this, looked into her eyes, and softly said, since you want to kill me, should I still cherish you? Your thoughts are too absurd and ridiculous. Since I have shown you a path that will lead to less suffering, why don't you thank me? How can someone so afraid of death be worthy of being a scout? Seelili clenched her teeth in anger and raised her head in hatred, a pair of deep eyes piercing through her slightly disheveled hair and staring at Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian's face was quiet. Don't talk too much about giving up your life and forgetting your death. In fact, you're not a stupid person, knowing that even if you confess to the great members of the court who colluded with Northern Qi, you'd be spared death in the end, so you simply gritted your teeth and didn't say anything. Seelili suddenly felt Duke Fan's voice speaking farther and farther away, getting lighter and lighter, yet more and more terrifying. I'm not a member of the court. I simply want to find that person and take revenge. I'm willing to make a deal with you. Other than trusting me, there is no other path for you to take. Fan Xian spoke lightly, but his words were chilling, his voice getting lower and lower, as if he were talking to himself. I'm a man who doesn't mind torturing a woman because you thought of killing me first. At the same time, I am a feminist who believes that in a life and death struggle, men and women are inherently equal. After all, he had been digging graves since he was a child, and his apparent cleanliness and disinterestedness couldn't completely hide the occasional outbursts of brooding terror in his bones. Wang Qinian left in silence and went to get that cell head to come and open the door while preparing a set of relevant torture tools. Countless screams of weak women resounded in the deep heavenly prison. After a long time, Fan Xian frowned slightly as he looked at Seelili, who had fainted on a pile of hay, and looked at her bloodied fingers without a trace of expression on his face. On the contrary, Wang Qinian, who had been silent beside him, had some strange feelings in his heart. He really couldn't imagine that such a clear and uncluttered gentleman could still be so calm after seeing the horrifying sight of the previous torture. He really didn't know how much unknown coldness was hidden under the gentleness on Lord Fan's face. For the torture to work, the process needs at least 5 days. Wang Qinian swallowed with some difficulty and explained in a low voice, this Seelili in front of him is obviously a novice, that's why he made his lordship force out some information, but in the final analysis, he's a trained person. And once it comes to a secret that must be kept, and he can't withstand the physical pain, he naturally faints. Fan Xian had already hidden his face under his gray robe when the terrifying cell head came. The cell head began to rickettily pack up the torture equipment, shaking his head as he did so. This young lord, torture is also a learned skill, and the fact that you have to ask for it in just half an hour is in itself an insult to us professionals. Fan Xian was momentarily exasperated and sidled up to let the cell head leave, watching him walk away before he opened his mouth and said to Wang Qinian with a bitter smile, "It seems like it's better to leave it to the professionals. We'll just come and wait for the news in a couple of days. I see that with the defenses here, there shouldn't be anyone who has the ability to sneak in and silence them." Just about to leave, Si Lili woke up leisurely, touched the finger wound, the pain of the miserable voice screams, weekdays in the courtesan boat to get strings and brother's lips and hands. Today the hand has been destroyed, lips can only make miserable sounds. Fan Xian slightly lurched, turned back to look at her through the fence. Si Lili was biting her lower lip, her face was pale, cold sweat had long since dampened her hair, and her two eyes were staring fiercely at Fan Xian's face like a lioness after an injury, seemingly wanting to memorize all of his features in her mind. Fan Xian stood looking at her in silence like this, and Wang Qinian knowingly snatched a distance away. "Put away the bottle of medicine I gave you just now, and if you really feel you can't stand it the next time you use torture, take it." Fan Xian used death to test the other party for the second time, his tone very indifferent. Si Lili finally couldn't help but cry out at this point, looking at him with hatred, her gaze incomparably resentful.